Good evening, you're watching Estuary TV News. Coming up, supply and demand, the revitalisation of a weekday market in Beverley. More politics, David Davis launches the Conservative campaign in Grimsby. And I'll be talking to the Reverend Catherine Magdalene Price about her new book about finding religion. Welcome to Estuary TV News. I'm Hugh Richards. First of all, it's over to James Dunn for the news headlines.
Police are looking for a registered sex offender thought to be on the loose in the Grimsby area. Mark Hudgell is currently wanted by police who are appealing for information on his whereabouts. The Conservative Party claim the battle for Great Grimsby seat isn't just a two-horse race between Labour and UKIP, as it's been billed by the national press. UKIP leader Nigel Farage hit national headlines yesterday as he launched former Tory Victoria Ayling's election campaign for the seat. Halton Price and Howden MP David Davis launched the Conservative campaign today in a much more sedate affair at Grimsby Fish Market. He told Estuary that voters shouldn't write off the Tories, who finished a very close second in the 2010 election.
In the last several elections, we have closed the gap time and time again on the Labour Party. We've got a very good candidate here, and in the last 5 years, Grimsby's unemployment, the biggest single issue is unemployment here, has gone down. It's almost halved. It's gone down by 1,700 from over 4,000 to about 2,500. So it's a really, really big change. This town, city, depends upon the wider economy doing well. There's only one party that can deliver that, and that's the Conservative Party.
Thieves stole tens of thousands of pounds worth of jewellery from a flat in North Hull by climbing a scaffolding and entering the roof window. They took a gold Rolex, a Raymond wheel watch, as well as a President bracelet worth £25,000 and a number of other smaller items between 9:30 p.m. on Saturday and 10:30 a.m. on Sunday. Police are reminding homeowners to be vigilant after the burglary on Morpeth Street, Hull. And finally, over 6 million of us are guilty of taking the batteries out of smoke alarms, and 2.5 million try and dry objects in the microwave. That's why Humberside Fire and Rescue is backing the Home Safe campaign with charity Electrical Safety First, encouraging people to take a look at electrical appliances and ask, is your home as safe as you think it is? This is one of the videos as part of the campaign, which shows a third of house fires were caused by the misuse of electrical fires last year, and 146 deaths as the result of a fire were in homes without working fire alarms. That's all from me. I'll see you next time. Bye.
Catherine Price is a curate at Grimsby Minster, now following a vocation in the most literal sense, but it was not always so. She's a convert from atheism and has written a book about rejecting an inquiry of truth by reason and instead relying on mere faith. Katie, am I being unfair?
Well, possibly a little, in that it's not a book primarily about my conversion experience. My conversion experience is the beginning of it, but it is more about the journey since then, and kind of how I got from being an atheist and from a completely non-religious background to sort of, as you see now, with the dog collar.
The dog collar is a clue.
Absolutely,
yes.
It is.
Let's show off the book. It's called, I think it's God Calling, and it's very nicely produced, little paperback. It's quite long. It's a good chunky read. Why did you decide to write a book about it? Well,
I was asked to, actually. It started off as a blog, and it started off as a blog really because, as you might imagine, the internal workings of the Church of England are a little bit arcane, especially for somebody who's come to it from the outside.
They're positively Byzantine.
Yes, well, that might actually count as a compliment.
Well, it certainly counts as its roots, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I was aware that this was a process that a lot of people were going through or exploring or thinking about or afraid to think about, and that there wasn't much out there to give the inside story. There were plenty of, the church has done a lot to encourage vocations, to encourage young vocations particularly, and women's vocations, because we've been underrepresented in the past. So there's a lot of official stuff.
Underrepresented women is an understatement
a little
of all
bit of
time,
an understatement,
I think, isn't
just
it?
a little bit. So there's a lot of official stuff out there, but what there wasn't at the time was something of the perspective of somebody who was coming to it new and was coming to it as the candidate rather than as somebody who was already part of the hierarchy.
Well, let's say, I mean, for a start, women and men, the numbers of people trying to become clergy people in the Church of England anyway are going down. You're running out of people.
Well, no, actually we're not. We had, this year in Lincoln Diocese, along with me, we were 19 people ordained in one diocese, which is actually huge.
But that's still not enough for one vicar per church, is it?
No, the problem is not a shortage of people going into it. The problem is a shortage of posts, a shortage of funding for the posts rather than...
A shortage of livings.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So you have increasingly, in many parts of the country, particularly rural areas, one priest for several churches. Now, the brilliant thing in Lincoln Diocese, and one of the things that attracted me to this diocese, is that the Bishop of Lincoln has, Christopher, he's very much seen that...
Do you know his surname?
Lawson.
Thank you.
Lawson. He very much wants to increase the numbers of clergy in the diocese, actually, and he is putting funding into increasing the numbers of clergy and the length and quality of training that they've had. So I think we're hopefully seeing a little bit of a turn away from that sort of situation of managed decline.
I always think there's this dreadful phrase, a team vicar, isn't
Well,
there?
we will hopefully be getting one.
A team vicar. I always assumed they swap shirts at the end of the service.
Well, we are all about working in teams now, and I think that, for me, that makes a lot of sense. That there's the old-fashioned model of you are one priest and you are a law unto yourself in your own, you have the freehold and you are sort of king of the castle of your parish. Actually, that isn't using people to the best of their abilities, because people have strengths and weaknesses.
It's the right way, though, isn't it? I mean, there should be the parson and the squire, and that's how a village community should be governed.
I think there is some strength in that, in the sense that I think it's really good to be a visible presence in a community. And in a smaller community in particular, you really can do that, and you can be known to the people. But I think there's also the risk of that you can get... we're all pretty idiosyncratic characters, and what you don't want is somebody who just pushes the church into their own, however they want it to be, and then they leave and the next person comes in and it's all change again. I think there's more of a sense now that we are collaborative.
You get what sort of tambourines one day and incense the next.
Yeah. I think there's more of an understanding now that it is collaborative, that we're relying enormously on the lay people. The lay people are the church. They're the people who are running it. They're the people who are going to make it work or not work. And that we need to play to our strengths and weaknesses together. And I think, and this may or may not be fair, but I think that having more women in the church has actually encouraged that more collaborative, that more sort of being prepared to say, there are some things I can't do, there are some things other people can do better.
Right.
And rather than feeling that we have to do a sort of macho, I'm perfect at everything.
Okay, well, you mentioned women in the church. There's a far older tradition of women priests and priestesses, far more ancient than Christianity, and in some ways much more rich in literature. Why has it taken so long for the Christians to stop having a problem with girls?
That is, that's a very big question. I think the way I would see it is that actually it was an example, and something we should therefore repent of, an example of the church going along with wider society. I mean, it's very noticeable that every other profession women were excluded from, and almost by default they ended up being excluded from the priesthood as well. I think in the early church you see much greater equality, but what happens very quickly is that the values of the world get in there.
The early church, much greater equality.
I would say so.
I won't get terribly scriptural here, but surely there has not been a greater misogynist in the world than St. Paul, who was the inventor of the early church.
I actually personally love St. Paul.
Do you?
There are some fantastic bits of Paul. One of my...
Well, there's not a lot of jokes there, are there?
What I like about St. Paul is how urgent and impatient he is. It's like, this stuff is important, listen up, let's get on with it.
We'll come back and talk a bit more about your book, Katie.
Sure, yes, of course.
In a moment, but we'll have to stop there and don't go away. Back in a second. You're watching Estuary TV News. A little later, we offer another Dog of the Week, looking for a new home And Dan Kemp will bring you all the sports news. Once one of the more popular markets in East Yorkshire, Beverley's Wednesday market has seen a fall in business in recent times. But now the Town Council has organised a pilot scheme of 6 monthly market days to try to encourage shoppers back to the stalls. Dan Kemp went to this historic market town to find out more.
In the shadow of Beverley Minster, Wednesday Market has been a regular shopping stop for generations, but the rise to prominence of out-of-town retailers has been in somewhat of a decline in recent times.
In the past few years, it has become somewhat underused and underachieved in a way the number of people who are actually attracted to this area on a midweek.
But it's all changing thanks to the High Street Fund. Wednesday saw the first of the pilot scheme market days take place and it proved extremely popular. Ed Hawkes works for one Beverley-based company and couldn't speak highly enough of its impact.
It's absolutely fantastic, yeah. I mean, it's usually a little bit of a quiet time for us, so it's nice to come down somewhere where there's a bit of activity, yeah.
Feedback up to now has been excellent. You know, we've had it's only been on for an hour, 2 hours, and it's as you mentioned, Dan. It's busy. It should continue a bit busy. It'll probably pick up during the course of the day, and the feedback has been absolutely very, very good. You know, from both the stall holders and the local traders.
By the end of the 6 months, well, we're just hoping to build a bit of a name up for ourselves on this side of town rather than the other side of town where our shop is, but mostly just take part in the local community here.
Yesterday's market wasn't only about selling products to local people, but also about keeping people engaged with the area. Cooking demonstrations and children's activities were also on offer to the hundreds of people who were taking advantage of the Easter sun.
Today might not be a great example to use because we've got this initiative which we hope's added interest, but it is a holiday week. As you see, the sun's shining, kids are off school, so you're going to get more footfall into the town centre on today than you would on a normal Wednesday.
And the next Wednesday market takes place on the 13th of May, although knowing Beverley's market naming policies, there's no reason to think that's necessarily Wednesday. You can get more details on our Facebook pages. Catherine Price is still with me. Katie Price, can't quite make up your name, as you do mention in the book.
Yes.
Another thing you mention in the book is that you can't stand being interviewed.
Yes, I do actually say that. As you can imagine, the process of getting to where I am now required being quite a lot of interviews.
Okay.
And I can't quite remember what I said about my experience of interviews, but more or less that I tend to leave my brain at the door. So.
Okay, well, you're doing terribly well here, and I will try to keep this purgatory as short as possible, but we need to know a little bit more.
Thank you.
So you grew up in a very unreligious sort of a background.
Absolutely, completely.
It was a sort of rigorously scientific background, not there's necessarily a contradiction.
Yes.
Not a philosophical contradiction, anyway.
No.
So what was your family were all involved in test tubes and Bunsen burners? And
Not quite. My father was a physicist when I was growing up. He now has his own business, and my mother had studied medicine. And they're certainly quite... I suppose it would be an exaggeration to say that they're down to earth, because they're quite eccentric. But yes, they certainly had no time whatsoever for religion, and nor did I, to be fair.
Well, not down to earth and quite eccentric sounds a perfect upbringing in any case. Anyway, so you had no particular religion, and then suddenly you're the fan of St. Paul. You had a Damascene moment.
Pretty much, and it was actually almost exactly 7 years ago. I think it was 7 years ago to the day.
Okay, well, how auspicious.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there was a long period, and there was also an immediate point. I think it's like that for a lot of people, that there was a process of exploring and thinking and asking questions and experiencing, because we were talking a little bit before we went there about that I studied history, and I studied medieval history. And of course, you can't get away from the church and religion is a massive motivating factor in people's lives if you're studying history. And for me, coming from that completely secular background, it was just baffling. And it was baffling for me seeing other religious people that I knew, including my husband, and just trying to think, what is going on inside their minds? And because I am inquisitive, I wanted to understand that. I wanted to get inside that. And that was actually really why I started going to church. And I was quite upfront about it. I am an atheist. I'm coming along to listen to the music and learn a bit and see what it's all about.
Enjoy the stained glass and the
all
smell
of
of wood
that,
polish.
Absolutely, which is why I'm very much in favour, actually, of, some people say we should get rid of our old buildings. Actually, old buildings are a way in for so many people. They can understand beauty, and they can understand the idea that this beauty was created to worship God, and they can then start to think, well, why? You know, what are they trying to communicate with that?
You don't need God to have beauty, do you? There's no necessary
Well,
condition of one on the other.
You don't, and yet it is amazing how often artists of all kinds, whether this is visual artists, literature, film or whatever, come back and back and back to religious themes and religious images, because there is a depth there.
That's because a tradition regenerates itself, though, isn't it? If you do it in the Renaissance, everybody who's modern is going to want to do what the Renaissance did. Everybody in the Renaissance is going to do what they did in Byzantium. There's a self-perpetuating tradition in the arts and in the culture.
Well, there is a tradition, and I don't think there's anything wrong with people wanting to understand more about their own tradition, actually, and the tradition.
You said you were too modest to say that
country.
you studied medieval history
Yes,
at Oxford.
I did.
I wasn't as clever as you, but I studied medieval history as well. And
Yes.
the excuse for religion there, my perception was that it was a superpower bloc. It was the Orthodox or the papacy against the Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire or France. It was boring if there weren't Normans coming from the south and imperial armies coming from the north. It was like a sort of medieval Soviet doctrinaire ideology, wasn't it?
Well, it was certainly had a lot of power, certainly had an enormous amount of power, which was sometimes used for good and sometimes was not. And certainly, I mean, I'm a member of the Church of England. The Church of England broke away from the papacy. Part of that was to do with the fact that the papacy was a power. It was a political power. It had its own lands. It had its own...
Still built prettier churches than we did there in the 16th century, didn't they?
Really?
Yes.
You don't like our churches?
I like a dome.
No, you see, I can't be doing with all that.
You tell a lot of stories
I prefer
of your training to be a priest, which wasn't simple, wasn't easy. Is it necessary when training priests to tell them not to get drunk in public?
Yes.
What was that training like? What was that process like? I mean, you were obviously an academic, you're an intellectual, you're going back to study again.
Well, everybody's experience of this is different, because one of the interesting and brilliant things, actually, is that God calls people from all different backgrounds. So the training has to be a little bit more tailored to what each person needs and the background they're coming from. I mean, I was training alongside people who were in their early 20s and people in their early 50s, and from a whole range of backgrounds in terms of what they'd studied before. For me personally, I was in a monastic college. I was in Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, Mirfield, and it's the only one of its kind in the country that is run alongside an Anglican monastic community.
Would you recommend this? Your vocation, I suppose, is the word to use for it, but this line of work, as it were.
If you are called to it, it is the only thing you can do, and if you are not called to it, don't even think about it. It's as simple as that.
Becky, I suspect that's extremely wise advice. Katie, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Yesterday, UKIP's Nigel Farage launched his party's campaign in Grimsby by talking to Joey Essex, somebody who knows nothing about politics. As we saw in the headlines today, the Conservatives' David Davis launched his party's campaign at the Fish Market, and he spoke to our equally ream but rather better informed correspondent Dan Kemp, who asked Mr Davis about his reaction to the UKIP threat.
I have to tell you, Mr. Farage's coverage yesterday is not perhaps coverage you necessarily wanted. He demonstrated he didn't know the history of Grimsby, didn't know what had caused the problems in the fishing industry here. It was down to Iceland, not down to Europe, or not principally down to Europe. He clearly didn't understand the employment situation here, because he said, "Oh, well, there's been a boom in the economy, but you haven't seen it." Well, he obviously didn't know the unemployment figures. I mean, basically, I'm afraid, you can't just go around the country giving a sort of insurgent message without actually knowing what you're talking about, and I'm afraid that's what happened with Nigel yesterday. In the last 5 years, Grimsby's unemployment, the biggest single issue is unemployment here, has gone down, it's almost halved. It's gone down by 1,700 from over 4,000 to about 2,500. So it's a really, really big change. This town, city, depends upon the wider economy doing well. There's only one party that can deliver that, and that's the Conservative Party. The simple truth is the Conservative candidate, irrespective of name, last time got within 700 votes or thereabouts of Labour. It was because that was a reflection on the Conservative Party more than anything else. And I think this next result will largely depend on that. But we have got an incredibly good candidate in Mark Jones. I'm standing here holding a book that he wrote about Grimsby. He's a man who cares about Grimsby. It's the only seat he's ever applied for. There are other safe seats around here he could have applied for. He didn't. He applied for Grimsby. And it's because he cares about Grimsby.
Now here's the sport with Dan Kemp.
Hull City's Premier League clash against Liverpool, scheduled for next weekend, will now be rearranged. The game was set to be played on Saturday the 18th of April, but Liverpool's involvement in the FA Cup semi-finals has now meant it must be altered. They beat Blackburn Rovers in a quarter-final replay last night, with Felipe Coutinho scoring the only goal. Scunthorpe United manager Mark Robbins is hopeful the side can welcome back duo Neil Bishop and Niall Canavan for their final 6 games of the season. The latter was set to feature at MK Dons on Tuesday night but pulled out of the warm-up, still suffering the effects of a recent head injury. Bishop has returned to training following a hernia operation, and Robbins is hoping he'll now be available for the League One run-in. This weekend sees the first ever home game for Hull's American football team. The Humber Warhawks gained entry to the BAFA, the British American Football Association, for the upcoming season, and host the Peterborough Saxons at Hull Enzian's Rugby Ground from 2:30 on Sunday afternoon. In the Northern Counties East Premier League, Cleethorpes Town host Handsworth Paramore on Saturday afternoon, whilst Barton Town are at Worksop Town. In Division 1, we have 2 local derbies to look forward to. Hall Road Rangers host Bottisford Town, and Winterton Rangers are at Grimsby Borough. Meanwhile, Louth Town are away to AFC Mansfield. And on Cleethorpes Town, they've appointed Grimsby Borough chairman Ken Vincent as their new first-team physio. Vincent played for Boston United and has been on the backroom staff at Boston Town, Grimsby Borough and Brigg. He's now looking forward to pushing on his own development, along with helping the NTEL sides progress through non-league. Don't hesitate to get in touch if you've got any stories for us. You can call 01472 31 553. And that's all for the sport.
Thanks, Dan. Let's have a look at our weekly pooch. This one's gorgeous.
365 is Rosie, an 8-year-old Patterdale that came into us just this week. Very steady, doesn't like cats and doesn't like dogs as well, but if it's in the right home, it'll make a lovely little pet.
Just a reminder, Katie Price's book available via Amazon. Google it if you want to find it. If you have a story, please find us at the usual contacts on the screen in front of you. That's all we have time for tonight. Until tomorrow, good evening.
Estuary TV's weather, sponsored by Hornsby's, celebrating 100 years in buses.
Hello and welcome to Estuary TV's weather. Friday is going to be warm again, but sunshine becoming increasingly hazy under high cloud, and there will be a fresher southerly breeze, maximum temperatures of 20 degrees. Saturday is going to be much fresher, and over the rest of the weekend, dry and bright for most of Saturday, perhaps some rain.
Estuary TV's weather, sponsored by Hornsby's, celebrating 100 years in buses.